Unit 15 P1. Let's find out exactly what you have to do in order to complete this task. We know that it's about the principles of game design and prototyping, and the first area we're going to think about is the key considerations that support game design, if you like, the grammar of game design. What is it that game designers have at their disposal in order to make a game? To do that, we're going to look at the key features that you might find in typical games. And in order to best achieve this task, you're going to look at different sorts of games and then talk about those key features and describe their purpose. What do these key features bring to different games? So let's move on and have a look at the next part. This, from the teaching material, is what you are expected to show an understanding of over the course of P1. I'm going to go forward and show you the next slide, which will give you a better idea of how this might come together. So first of all, on the left hand side here, you can see all of the areas that you should have covered. Purpose of game, first, third person view, player characters, non-player characters, sprites, achievement, attainment, maintaining a player's interest, interactions, immersion and competition. So I'm in a moment going to go through each of these in turn and tell you what they are and what they can bring to a game. And then you, on the right hand side, are going to have a look at 3 or 4 different games, which are, and I recommend 3, 3's perfectly enough. 3 games, but they've got to come from completely different genres. So if you pick Pac-Man as one game, pick a strategy game as your second game. Or if you pick FIFA, then pick a driving game or pick an action game, but pick 3 games that are entirely different. And the other thing that's worth mentioning is that your game does not have to be a video game. It can be a board game, it can be any type of game that you fancy. There's no stipulation that it has to be a video game in the specification. So it's almost quite nice to pick something like backgammon or blackjack or even tic-tac-toe, doesn't matter what it is, but a game that's an option open to you either way. Alright, so let's go on to now talk about the detail here and how we're going to go through each element of what you're expected to talk about. It's worth mentioning this list is not a prescriptive list. This is not a writing frame for you. These are simply the areas you may want to consider in each of the different features. So the first one, what is the purpose of the game? Example, is there a narrative? Is there a story that drives the game forward? If there is, what is it? We're not looking for a huge level of detail here, but it would be useful to know to what extent this story actually drives the game forward. The next question is, what is the goal of the game? So there has to be a goal, an outcome, a reason for playing it. So when you're thinking about the reason for playing it, how do you achieve that goal? How do players fail in achieving it? How do you lose a life? How do you get deducted points? How do things go wrong in the game? The next thing you may want to consider is what happens when you achieve your goal. How do you know when you've achieved your goal? Do you get points? Do you go to the next level? Is there a boss battle at the end? All of these sorts of things. How does the gameplay evolve over time? Alright, the next thing we're going to look at is the obstacles. I taught you in class about Bernard's suits and the fact that in games there is an obstacle, an unnecessary obstacle that you willingly take on. In the game that you're discussing or debating, what are the obstacles that have to be overcome? In Pac-Man, you have to pick up the pellets, but you have to avoid the ghosts. The ghosts are the obstacles, because if they catch you, you lose a life and you only get 3 lives. And lastly, and it's really important this is in there for every single game, what is the win state of the game? What do I mean by that? How do you know you've won? When do you finish the game? What does it look like? What happens? So for example, in campaign mode for Call of Duty, you complete the adventure. Let's go on to the next one and think about the view of the character. Typically, you play in first person view or third person view. I'm going to take third person view first, which is the bottom one here, and on the bottom right you can see this is a screenshot from the very first Grand Theft Auto, and you can see it's in third person view, it's from above. And this actually wasn't because they thought it would make for a better game, it's because at the time that's how the games generally were. It hadn't quite evolved to first person view at that time. And then latterly Grand Theft Auto and all of the other shooting games became third person view, as you can see on your screen here. This is an example of Grand Theft Auto, Call of Duty, and you name it, they're all in first person view, aren't they? Think about, once you've stated what the view is, what is the benefit of that view? So for example, first person view brings the idea of excitement, it's real, it's intimate, you feel like you're there, it adds stress, you have to make decisions on the hoof, and it makes it feel like the real thing, and that also adds to the immersion that we'll talk about a bit later on. Third person view lends itself more to a game of strategy. Think about Civilization. Civilization couldn't work in first person view because Civilization involves having different tasks that you've got going on over here or over here, and you can't do that from first person view. So third person view gives you perspective, it gives you an overview, and it's better for planning ahead. Alright, so let's move on to the characters. What is the purpose of the character? And what are the character's attributes? So when we talk about the purpose of the character, what does it achieve within the game? It's a tool. What does that tool do? The second thing is, talk about the attributes. What abilities, if you like, does your player have? So for example, in the case of Pac-Man, Pac-Man can move up, down, left, right. That's it. And then when I talk to you in class about the attributes, don't forget that in the case of all of the games, some of the attributes of your characters are dynamic and some of the attributes of your characters are static. So in the case of a car in a Formula 1 game, the dynamic attribute could be your current speed. So you could be doing 50 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour, or 140 miles an hour. That's dynamic, that can change. But then the static attribute of a Formula 1 car will be the top speed. Of course, it's complicated by you might finish a stage and upgrade your car, and then it moves from 160 to 200 miles an hour. But you've got attributes that are static and dynamic, and that could be something worth exploring when you're describing the player characters in your game. In the teaching material, the word sprite randomly appears, and it may well be your game doesn't contain sprites, but a sprite is a 2D bitmap image, something like Pac-Man or Space Invaders, and it's usually integrated into a larger scene or a larger space, the game space. Alright, so sprite, describe a sprite if you need to, depending upon the game that you're actually describing. Now we're going to move on and look at achievements. I think it might help, first of all, to look at examples of achievements and then jump back and see what the purpose of them is. So here you've got on the right hand side examples of different achievements. And we'll run through these one by one. You'll recognise these from gameplay. Collecting tokens or trophies or badges, awards, stamps, medals, challenges, in-game achievements, mini-games, all of these sorts of things are achievements in the game. But the reason that they're described as being achievements is because they are not necessarily central to the game. You could take achievements away and the game would still play from A to Z from beginning to end, but the achievements will add something else to it. And so I'll jump back to the previous slide and talk to you about the benefit or purpose of having achievements. Firstly, from a game designer's perspective, putting achievements within the game means that the game will take longer to play. It extends the game's longevity, both in the marketplace and for individuals playing the game. Game players will very quickly review games, and if a game takes 2 or 3 hours to play through and it costs £50, it won't do well because people won't see it as being good value for money. There's also this notion that including including achievements also means that it encourages people to complete all the challenges within the game, to complete all the levels to a certain standard. For example, gold, silver and bronze, or doing things within a certain amount of time, all of these can be are often achievements within a game. It'll give people the satisfaction of completing challenges to a high standard, and also there's also this element of satisfaction of completing the set, of finishing the game totally, of rinsing the game of everything that it can give you. And there's also, finally, that satisfaction of actually beating the game. You have beaten every challenge, overcome every challenge that you were set. An unnecessary obstacle, going back again to what Bernard Suits said. So I want to now have a look at attainment. Attainment, different from achievement in the fact that attainment is about success within the game, winning or losing the game. How do you know that you're succeeding in the game itself? Is it by being given points? Is it by being awarded gifts? Is it by going past the next level? Is it by completing a boss battle? It's interesting how you can go back and look at a game that was made 20 years ago and the same principles apply. The level 1 starts quite easy, of course. You end up playing through to a boss battle where you've got a bigger challenge, and then you end up going to level 2 where things become slightly more complicated. You might have more tools available to you, and again a boss battle at the end that's quite challenging. So talk about attainment in terms of winning and losing the game, and how do you progress, how do you succeed within the game that you're playing. The next question is, how does a game designer maintain a player's interest? What is it the game designer can put in place to keep you wanting to play the game? We talked about achievements, tokens, booster packs, etc. But what about challenges that can be unlocked, or a sense of competition, competing against yourself, competing against others online, a high score board, for example? What about secrets, the Easter eggs? They're very popular within certain types of games. What within the interface makes you want to keep playing? Is it the level of detail? Is it the effort that's been put into it? Is it the realism of the interface? And of course the challenge becoming greater over time. Player interactions. This one's quite easy. How does the player interact with the game? Is it through a joystick? Is it through a controller? Is it through a VR headset? What method do you interact with the game that you're describing, and what's the benefit of interacting that way? And even what are the difficulties? Sometimes there are so many buttons that you need to press that it can become overly complicated, and it can have an effect on cognitive load and make the game not that pleasurable to play, and in fact so frustrating that you might give it up. And don't forget, we are talking about frustration in terms of a necessary part of a game. A game has to be frustrating and challenging, but it can't be so frustrating that you simply want to give it up. Immersion. Immersion is about feeling that you are in the world where the game is taking place. This quotation, media contents are perceived as real, so that what you're doing feels real, in the sense that the users, i.e. you, experience a sense of being spatially located in the mediated environment. It's a fancy way of saying you feel like you're there. How's that achieved within the game that you're describing? And there are various ways that can happen. So for example, multi-sensory channels. We're talking about layered sounds and layered videos. For example, if you have a scene at sea, you could have a seagull overhead and the noise of a seagull. You can layer this with noises of the sea, noises of water hitting a boat, noises of a distant foghorn, noises of chitter chatter in the background. All of these help build to make you feel as though you're actually there, and of course that can be audio and video. If the world that you're going feels as though it is an entire universe, it's more likely to help you believe that you are actually there. In other words, there are no details missing. The world that you're in is believable. The world that you're in that's been created by the game designer makes sense. And also that the world that you're visiting is interesting, it's cognitively challenging, it's visually appealing, or it's in some way challenges you. And what about the plot? Oftentimes there is a plot, especially with adventure games. Does the plot drive it forward? Do you want to know what happens next? Do you want to know what happens to the main character? or is it just about the gameplay? I think often designers kid themselves into thinking we care more about the plot than we actually do. Most of the time it's just about the gameplay, which of course has to be spot on. Progression. How do you progress in the game? Notice that you may have covered these elements already, so do not feel the need to repeat yourself, but just make sure that you've covered all of these sorts of elements within the games that you're describing. What do you have to do to score points? How do you get to the next level? How do you become better or learn skills over time? So that's about progression, about moving through the game. Competition. Is there competition? Is there a high score? Is there a leaderboard? Is there a community? There often is a community that is obsessively checking for when new materials come out, when a booster pack is released, when a new character is released, when the next release of the game will come out, and what the Easter eggs and what the cheat codes are, and so on. So this is quite a huge thing within the gaming world. How do you compete? Against yourself, against others, against the clock? So, and of course, all of these things link together. The community will probably be posting videos, certainly on YouTube, of how they actually progress within the game.